All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. Super excited about this presentation. So, very, very compelling topic. If you were pretty much anywhere in the central United States this weekend, you were probably under a tornado watch at some point. Tons of really relevant content within this presentation today. So really looking forward to dive in. And thank you so much for joining us. So without further ado, I do want to progress along here. First of all, my name is Jeremy Hudson. I'm a Vice President of Client Services at Open Sky Group. Open Sky is an implementer of warehouse management, transportation management, and labor management solutions. And so we've been in this space for over 19 years, and luckily we have some wonderful clients such as Reckitt and Kenco that we help implement all types of supply chain solutions for. So really excited anytime we can get clients to present and share their knowledge with a group like this. Always beneficial for us. And so I'll say it a few times, but firstly, thank you to our wonderful clients for doing this. And so without further ado, I'm going to let Monique introduce herself. You'll notice she's not in the room, so we'll play her quick intro
Good afternoon,
video.
everybody. My name is Monique Wolf, and I'm here as Site Director for Kenco Logistics. I have over 20 years experience in the logistics industry, working my way from a case order picker all the way into efficiency improvements, financials, and then now as a member of the senior leadership team. I am looking forward today to sharing my experience over the last 8 months in crisis management, and I hope that you guys learned something from what we have to share today. Thank you for attending.
All right, awesome. And then Stacy, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Hi guys, my name is Stacy Siglin. I have about 15 years of experience in the supply chain and logistics. I started out at a 3PL, so I worked about 9 years in transportation. And then I moved over to Reckitt, and I've done a lot of different roles such as demand planning, customer service. I was a global PM for our Center of Excellence team. And more recently, I managed our transportation team, and now I am the manager of 3 of our 7 warehouses throughout the U.S. for Reckitt.
All right, Jess.
Hi, my name is Jess Claypool. I live in Evansville, Indiana, and I've been with Reckitt for about 12 years. It's been my only a grown-up adult job, and I've done a lot of different stuff. My first role was actually in the customer call center, so I would take calls from people who were mad or confused or sad about our products, and my job was to de-escalate these folks all day. And I've been able to carry those skills from my early days at the company into more relevant roles in supply chain and logistics, and most recently in the crisis management that we've all been working through in these last few months. So it's one of those experiences that you can look back on with gratitude, even though it was a really hard time in your life. But you can be grateful for what you learned and for getting through it. And that was the case early on in my career, and that's been the case more recently.
All right, so that's a little bit about us. And so our topic today is going to center around this next video, which is something you never want to see and recognize.
Thanks, Emmy. A facility in Mount Vernon took one of the hardest hits by those storms Tuesday. The Kenco Logistics Services building in Posey County was left with extensive damage. Part of the building's roof was ripped off and torn to shreds, causing significant damage both outside the facility and inside of it. Thankfully, we're told nobody inside was injured when that storm hit.
All right, so that's why we're here, right? Because that's the story we're able to tell. That was the 3 of us, our lives for quite a while, and still our lives to some extent. And so obviously excited to share a lot of our learnings from that experience with you, and what's really important when you have that type of disaster to react to. So from an agenda standpoint today, we do want to spend some time talking about safety, as well as kind of what that moment was like for Kenco and Reckitt. And so we'll spend a little bit of time on that topic, and then after that, we really want to share learnings, what the response was like, what we did from a customer-facing standpoint, and what we did to make sure we sustained the business. And so those are the topics we'll be talking to. And
like, it's just,
I want to start by talking safety. And so, as you saw there, I went to Evansville, Indiana, and did some video footage with Monique. Monique was originally intended to be here, but she unfortunately had a leadership training course that could not be moved this week. So you'll see a few interview videos from her, and then we'll talk more with Stacy and Jess around some of the recovery efforts as well. But I want to start with safety. This is such a compelling story, specifically because during this event, not a single person was injured. It was an active warehouse that was running, fully staffed at the time, ongoing deliveries, receipts, etc., and not a single person was injured in this event, which is absolutely phenomenal. And so I do want to talk a little bit about the culture and what went into that, and more importantly, I want Monique to talk about it. So we'll do our first clip with her, and then go ahead and progress.
It really goes back to our culture, which starts with our Kenco operating system. So we follow the Shingo model, which starts with 5S. So having everything in its place obviously ties directly into safety on a day-to-day basis, not just in a situation like this. So also part of that is just being principle driven, so tying in quality, which goes into our standard operating procedures, which again ties back to safety, right? So having really good procedures around weather events, evacuations, also just tying in those drills. So we do safety drills every quarter to every 6 months, depending on what type of drill it is. And so that helps create that structure. So whenever you do have an event, then our team is prepared as they were in the situation and are able to keep each other safe. We had done drills recently where we had drivers outside and hadn't accounted for the drivers. And so we had been working internally, not just with our team, but also with Reckitt on how do we ensure that we know down to every driver, every contractor who's on site at any moment in time. So in an event like this, we can get them inside. We also worked together with Allied Services, who provided security for that as well. We also have partnered recently with local emergency services groups. So we did a safety fair and we invited them out to have them tour our warehouse and walk through with the team what would happen in the event of a fire and how they should react. And then also, turning gas lines off, things like that. So it was helpful for our team to be able to partner with emergency services, so they were comfortable that they knew their part, but they also knew that there was going to be somebody there in the end to be able to help them after an event like this as well.
So a couple of quick points here before we move on from this topic. This facility, when we walked into this site for the first time, it was excessively 5S, like to a comical extent almost. I mean, there was lines painted on the floor where every trash can should be, where every binder should be, where everything should be, and you look at that and you scratch your head and go, wow, this seems excessive. It was not. I was wrong, right? They were right. Extremely important to have that kind of systematic, commitment to safety. A couple other things I'll call out. She mentioned they did previous drills and did not account for drivers in the yard. You'll hear later how important that was, that learning lesson from the drills and then ultimately changing processes accordingly. Lastly, I really want to emphasize the cooperation with their local emergency teams, right? So, bringing the fire department, et cetera, out to the facility prior to this event, right, was extremely helpful in familiarizing their employees as well as the local authorities kind of how the building was structured as well as reactionary efforts. So the next slide here and the next video is incredibly valuable in my opinion. So this is actually where Monique can walk us through those events. She was in the building at the time, and so very, very compelling video on this specific piece. So really tune in. This is going to be really, really insightful around what actually happened that day and how they reacted accordingly.
It was July 9th, 2024, and I was in my office preparing a town hall meeting for the next day. So first shift had left, second shift had just arrived, and I was trying to finish up a few things, and it was bright and sunny outside, but there were threats of storms coming through. About 3:54 p.m., the the sound came across the phone, actually, the warning. And so I immediately reviewed my phone and went to security and asked if they had seen the warning as well. And they said yeah, and they were working on preparations, turning the alarm on and things like that. And so while they were working on that, I called my team, and I had a supervisor on one side of the building and a coordinator on the other side of the building, and made sure they knew the alarm had come across, and even before we turned the sound on. And they said, yep, they were already preparing their teams, and they had already made announcements. And so we just began to take action and start gathering everybody. So my first thought was I need to be out there with my folks, and my second thought was I need to be in shelter. So as soon as I got back to the locker room, then you could feel this immense pressure building. The noise was honestly like a freight train, and they say that and you don't really think about that until you're in it. And the doors on the locker room started to kind of move, and so I immediately got back to the corner with the two security folks, and they were very upset, right? And so we just kind of huddled together and just tried to protect each other, And again, the pressure got really, really loud. I mean, to the point that we were holding our ears. And then a few seconds later, it was like it wasn't loud anymore, but we weren't really for sure what was going on because we were in the locker room. And I immediately started getting phone calls. And so I'd gotten a phone call from Lou, who was our coordinator in Parcel, and I remember I answered the phone and she said, Miss Monique, she said, a tornado hit the building, the roof is gone. And I said, I know Lou. I said, it's okay, just stay sheltered, keep each other safe. And she said, okay. And she, we hung up the phone, and then probably about 2 seconds later, she called me back and she said, there's a gas leak, we smell gas. And I said, okay. And so immediately I knew I had to figure out, was it over or what? Because now you're trying to decide, do you stay, do you go, right? And so I remember opening the door to the locker room, and the building was just gone. I mean, just the roof was gone. And so, at that point it was still raining a little bit. It was still a little bit windy, but you could kind of tell that the tornado was gone, right? You could kind of see the sun. And so I just said, get everyone out of the building and get to the front. And so called my supervisor that was on the other side and told him to do the same, and made sure they knew there was a gas leak, that it was important to get out and away from the building, and gathered the folks that were up front. And I went around and went out the front of the building, and by the time I got out of the front of the building, the emergency services were already there. How many people are in the building? How can I help? And so I went towards the west side, and I had them go towards the east side, and I told them, around about how many people we had in the building. And the goal was just to get them all to the front, and get them accounted for, and get them safe. And so I remember going around to the west side of the building, and there's just, people were just, everybody was reacting differently, right? So some folks were crying, some folks were running, some folks were just kind of in shock, moving slowly. Everybody was helping each other. We had one guy didn't get hurt, but he had some knee issues, and they had to crawl over things to get out of the building. And so, they were helping each other just kind of get up to the front of the building. And so we got everybody to the front, and got everybody accounted for, and at that point people are trying to get a hold of their families, and so they want their phones and all of those things, and not everybody had their phone, and they're worried about their cars because their cars are destroyed, right? And so we just kind of had to step back, and I had to tell everybody, look, safety right now, your safety is most important, right? And so don't worry about your phone, don't worry about your families, getting a hold of them. We'll figure all of that out, but right now we need to make sure everybody's here. We need to keep everybody together and safe. And so that's what we did. We just stayed gathered up there and worked with emergency services to kind of figure out what we needed to do next, right? You're turning off the gas and turning off the power, and it was just it was crazy. I think within minutes I probably had 50 to 60 missed phone calls, text messages, so it was crazy.
Wow. Yeah, so you can tell it was obviously a extremely All right, how about now? Yeah, good, thumbs up, yep, okay, cool. So yeah, obviously an incredible event there, right? Monique does a great job of describing it, and so I'm really happy we were able to get that. And so what I want to talk about next, so that was during the event itself, and again, I cannot say enough great things about how Kenko reacted to this, and the fact that everybody was safe is just phenomenal. But Stacy, what I want to do now is fast forward to the aftermath, right? So immediately afterwards, there's obviously a number of steps that need to take place. I know that's where you enter this story, right? And so if you don't mind kind of giving us a perspective of what that looked like the day after, the night after, right? And just kind of what some of the reactionary steps were.
Sure. One thing that Monique left out was that in the middle of her running outside of the building and then to across the street, she called me. So I still think that is just amazing, right? That with everything going on, she knew to call her customer. Well, she didn't have to, right? But she thought it best to call her customer. I was still sheltering in place at my in-laws because they have a basement. And got the call from Monique, and this sounds terrible to say out loud, I didn't actually believe the damage that was done to the site. So I live in Indiana. We have these warnings all the time. Majority of the time, right, pre-kids, we just stayed at home. My husband and I, right, acted like nothing was going on. Post-kids, now we do go over to my in-laws, but we don't take the alarms very seriously because they happen so often. So when Monique called, I shrugged it off as there probably is some light damage. It wasn't until about 10, 15 minutes later when, of course, the news, right, came on. They showed a picture of our warehouse, and that's what it looked like. That it took that, right, for me to kind of actually realize what was happening. I had to wait about 2 to 3 more hours for the rest of the sirens to stop and the weather to be okay. And then my husband actually drove me out to the site. One of the most important lessons that I learned that we're talking through at my 2 other sites, and I don't think Monique mentions it here in depth, was that once the employees were out of the building, they had to stay on site for likely longer than we would have wanted them to, because we had to take an account of every person that was in that building, and getting that list from our security vendor wasn't quite as easy as we would have liked it to be. So one of the major lessons learned that we're working on, right, is you need immediate access to be able to pull exactly who is in your building at all times. Thankfully, everyone was safe, and we were able to pretty quickly take account of all of our employees, plus visitors, plus drivers on site. But that's a definite lesson learned for any of us, right, that are trying to protect our employees and our people.
Great, yeah, and I will say a few additional pieces that Monique, when I mentioned when I was there, was just the importance of kind of reminding everybody, right, like, because everybody wants to go get their phones back out of the building. Everybody wants to go, check on their own families, right? And it was really important to kind of keep them all focused on making sure we had accounting. And unfortunately, another storm rolled through almost immediately after this. So they actually had to cross the street, go to a bank, shelter in place there. It was quite the unfortunate circumstance. But luckily, they were able to keep everybody together. The other thing that I would say is important, not necessarily something you'd think of all the time, they had to hire locksmiths to get people into their houses because their house keys were inside of that building that was no longer inhabitable, right? They had to hire or get the drivers that were delivering, they had to get them hotels. They had no place to be that night, right? And so there was a lot of little things like that that had to be taken care of to make sure people had a place to go. So just really, really interesting challenges that come along with this. So I want to move on, a little too far, right? To talking through some more of the people impacts. And Stacy, we'll start with you, right? And so obviously you're accountable to a lot of people in this circumstance, right? There's a lot of folks that immediately want answers. They're not all in Evansville, Indiana, right? And so I know you had to do quite a bit of communication and working with different people to make sure things were communicated effectively, et cetera. So why don't you tell us more about that?
Sure. I think I actually want to back up because I forgot something that I thought was really important. After I got on site, one of the most valuable support systems that we had was actually the fire department. They had come over to Kenco in our Mount Vernon site quarterly, right? They did drills on site, active participation with the EMS, and that 2 of their trucks sat on our site for about 72 hours after the event just to make sure, right, they helped control security, that the active gas leak that we had, right, everyone was safe. One of the biggest lessons learned was know, right, who your support system is in your town and continue to have a relationship with them. The relationships that we had prior to the tornado were the only reason that we were successful in overcoming all of the challenges. And then to actually answer your question, one of the biggest issues that we had after everything had calmed down, right, was trying to, Jess and I are on the ground, so we're doing the day-to-day, and it is trying to communicate up, right, effectively to the senior leaders, senior leaders of the company, and how to communicate to them what is actually happening without stopping our traction. Every minute counted. Every decision had to be made within seconds. So to try and tell them exactly what was going on and asking for their permission, we didn't have time, right? We had way too many challenges that were on the ground decisions minute by minute. So what we did was created a pretty easy escalation path, right? So we immediately signed a project manager, and they were able to funnel information from the ground up to our senior leaders. And then the other thing I was really proud of is I realized very quickly, and I think Jess helped me a lot with this, was if you create a KPI of some sort and give access, right, to the rest of your team to share that information, it stops a lot of the questions from coming. So in this instance, at first, right, we were extracting inventory, and what we were able to do is just showcase how much inventory we were extracting day over day. That kept a lot of the leadership at bay. They knew we were working. They knew not to bother us per se, but also gave them a sense of what was really going on the ground. And then the PM would communicate how to support, what support we needed, what decisions needed to be made. And that was really helpful in the success of the project and not slowing it down.
Yeah, and so obviously Stacy had a lot of accountability communicating up. I would say, something else we observed while we were there, certainly working with Kenco, was the amount of communication required to their team, right? I mean, these 100 plus individuals working in this warehouse that suddenly had no place to go to work, right? And then suddenly had a bunch of different places to go to work. And then suddenly had various different jobs they'd never done before. I witnessed forklift operators suddenly becoming janitors. I witnessed supervisors suddenly becoming site managers. I mean, there was just so much dynamicism to what people were being asked to do in that moment. And I think that something that was definitely learned was consistent communication. And I don't just mean consistently, sending a message, but also doing that in a very predictable way. I think it's so easy to use a disaster as an excuse to be somewhat disheveled and not kind of structured, right? But the team, both Reckitt and Kenco, did an incredible job of really structuring communication out to individuals and giving them live updates of, okay, here's the strategy for, where we're going to go next, what buildings we'll go to, what jobs we'll need, et cetera. And, Kenco and Reckitt's flexibility throughout this was incredible. I mean, I'll never personally forget, I was out on the floor working on a WMS thing, because that's what I do. And I was really focused on that WMS thing, and I really wanted it to work right, and I wanted it to do exactly what they needed. And I walked into the break room, and someone was on the phone with their auto insurance, arguing about how they were going to get reimbursed for this vehicle that was completely destroyed in a parking lot, right? And it made my WMS issue seem a lot less important, right? I mean, it's just people required so much flexibility during that time to kind of sort out those dilemmas. And so it was really, really important to be flexible and very dynamic, and just be as malleable as possible to everybody's needs. I think that heightened sensitivity in that time is a given, right? So just being aware of that and sensitive to that is important. All right, so next I do want to talk about the reaction for customers. This was a 700,000 square foot warehouse, right? Full of product, absolutely chock full of product that people wanted and bought and stocked shelves with, right? And so suddenly none of that is available, right? There's a lot of reactions required for that. And so Jess, I think we'll start with you on this one. This is where you played a major role, right? Is dealing with kind of, moving product along, getting it into other facilities, et cetera, all those different impacts. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that reaction?
Sure. So I think one of the main, there were 100 good ideas that happened every single second, but one of the best ideas that the people had was to immediately freeze the inventory in the WMS. And then that became the arbiter of truth for everything else that we did down the road, reporting to quality, finance, insurance, asset recovery folks. Anyone is now going back to our WMS as this one single source of truth. And we've used it still as a freeze, as a move for adjustments, quality, just everyone is using that information. And we also had to pivot from having the one 600 square foot warehouse, 35,000 pallets, something like that, to having 4 mini sites, because this was not only a finished goods site, it was also a plant support site. So we have a factory in Evansville. This Mount Vernon facility fed it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, constantly. And we had to keep the plant running throughout all of this. So our amazing partners at OSG helped us to extrapolate our one footprint for Mount Vernon into all of these mini sites, and it allowed us to continue feeding the plant. It allowed us to move inventory that was deemed safe and acceptable to our coastal DCs. We have one in Pennsylvania and Vegas, and so we were able to keep our operation moving almost seamlessly. Within a matter of a couple weeks, we were shipping again, and so that was just a huge support from this group, and of course the Kenco group as well.
Yeah, and something I found very, very impressive, right? They never stopped using software throughout this, right? I mean, the building didn't have a roof. There was zero electricity. And we never stopped leveraging the software, which I'll be honest with you, I've done a lot of WMS go-lives in pristine, brand new buildings. And people will stub their toe and stop using a software. And so the fact that they had this type of interruptive emergency and still had the wherewithal to get a Wi-Fi router plugged into a generator, charge RF guns, and then scan product as it was moved out of a building that wasn't a building anymore, right, into trailers, still do loading activities, etc., was phenomenal. And it was extremely important because we had KPIs from day one. We could report on exactly how much product had been moved out of the facility, how much was available in the new facilities or the temporary facilities. It was just extreme visibility was so helpful throughout this period. And quite honestly, I'd love to take credit for any of it, but it was your guys' team that said, hey, we've got to make sure we're following the system here. And so just an incredible job of really sticking to that rigidity. And I would also say just the amount of strategy that went into that. Stacy, I don't know if you want to add anything to this point or not around some of the contingencies.
When you were speaking, I was thinking of the ability that the systems gave us for traceability. I won't go into detail, but after Jess and I have had several visits from the government, right, government agencies that have been on site. They looked at our data because we use the software and the systems, and we passed with flying colors, which was a really proud moment. The other piece is down the line, you're working with insurance. I can remember the first few days that we were on site, and I mean, they're now our best friends, even though, right, they're from the insurance, but they were on site and going location by location, trying to check our inventory accuracy, and it was spot on. That felt really good. So little things that you can do upstream, right? Make sure your accuracy of your inventory is good, but also, right, continuing to try and push for that traceability throughout one of the biggest challenges. It really was the reason we were able to be successful. A lot more of our product would have had to been destroyed had we lost that traceability throughout the process. So to me, that was vital.
Yeah, and something I'll say from the Kenko aspect here that was very, very helpful. Jess mentioned it, but I want to reiterate. We opened up 4 facilities in a matter of 3 weeks from the time that tornado hit. So within 3 weeks of that tornado, there were 4 facilities that were previously uninhibited that suddenly held thousands of pallets of product. And the reason there was 4 is because if any of you are looking for a business opportunity, I recommend warehouse space in the Evansville, Indiana area. Turns out it's very scarce. So for any of you real estate moguls out there, build some big warehouses in Evansville. But there was barely any space to be had. So we were moving into facilities. Some of them were not ideal. Some of them required a lot of vacuuming and sweeping. But Kenko did an incredible job. You would expect like suddenly this team to parachute in, like this SWAT team that suddenly enters and they take over and they say, we're going to do this, this, and that. It wasn't any of that. They had cross-trained their folks extremely well to where we saw supervisors suddenly be capable of managing a site, and we saw put-away drivers suddenly be capable of picking, and we saw forklift operators, like I said, they were willing to be janitors or maintenance folks or whatever was needed, but it was extremely helpful to service the business because any business has kind of some level of tribal knowledge and familiarity that helps. And had they brought in that parachuted SWAT team that came in completely unfamiliar with the Wreck-It business, it would have been a second disaster for us. I mean, just sorting through, no, we don't do that. You have to follow this process. Having that familiarity with Kenko was incredibly helpful, that those folks were able to kind of rise to the challenge and be flexible and play different roles. And so the cross-training that took place before this ended up being extremely valuable afterwards. All right, so a few lessons learned. So I will start. One of the first things that I learned from this was how to make extremely important decisions, decisions that were, potentially had millions and millions and millions of dollars in impact and that impacted thousands of people, right? Those decisions needed to be made incredibly quickly. Something that was very helpful. We were all working 12 to 16-hour days easily, some of us more, to unhealthy extents, right? But something we started doing was we had a lot of strategic discussions in the evenings. So 8 p.m. at night, we'd be on an hour-long call discussing options for how we were going to do quality inspections, et cetera. And then we would break that call at 9, 10 p.m., right? We'd all go sleep for a while and probably have some pretty interesting dreams. But then we'd reunite in the morning and say, okay, what do we want to do about this? But it was very strategic to say, let's talk about all of our options, let's talk about pros and cons, et cetera, in the evenings. Come back in the morning, first thing, and make some decisions and say, we're going to chart this path. It was extremely helpful. Like being able to rest for a moment, digest information. You'd be shocked at how many times you went to bed leaning one direction and woke up with an epiphany, right? That ability to kind of digest information overnight, it's the only time we really had to make decisions. I mean, we had a building without a roof and there was rainstorms and wind and all these things to work around, and so we had to react so quickly. And having that ability to digest information and then come back the next day and make quick, important decisions was very, very helpful. So certainly recommend that approach. Obviously, hopefully none of us have to make decisions that quickly too often, right? But was very, very helpful in this instance.
You forgot the ice skating rink. that the slab turned into in December, January. So
Yeah.
our team that's still on site was literally sliding across on the ice.
Yeah, no,
For a couple months.
It's
So you
very,
forgot that one.
very hard to keep a facility dry. Something I'm not used to is a wet warehouse floor that becomes an icy warehouse floor. But yeah, it turns out those roofs are pretty helpful on buildings, right?
Sometimes,
so,
yeah.
Stacy, we'll start with you. More lessons learned.
Okay. I'm going to take this quite a few different places, so apologies. But I did make notes of some of the things that were really helpful for me in hopes that hopefully, you never have to experience it, but if you do, they would be helpful for you. The first is know who your PR contacts are. On my way to the site, they were creating a statement for me, and when I got to the site around 8 p.m. that night, I had a statement to give the news. But as I spoke to earlier, the fire trucks were able to help save me, from having to speak to the news, but kind of something you just wouldn't normally think through until you're driving, in a storm to a site, and what are you going to say to the media that your company is going to be okay with you saying? The next is security. Security was a major game changer for us, We had a really good relationship with our security team, and they were able to execute additional personnel that literally sat outside in chairs, because it was summer, to protect our site until we could get a fence up, and they're still there today supporting us in protecting our site. The worst piece of advice that I ever got when I was on site was that in the very first days after I did not need to track the expenses for all of the different crazy purchases that we were making. Think porta potties, think tables, chairs,
RF guns, TVs, external monitors so we could work in the warehouse.
I mean, we were at Ace Hardware and Lowe's every day. They said, don't track it. You don't need to worry about it. Absolutely wrong. So find someone in your organization that can help you. Throw the receipts at them. Take pictures. We started spreadsheets. We worked with a lot of vendors that thankfully we had great relationships with. We didn't have to have an immediate PO. They were going to do the work because they trusted us. That was very helpful. I know that's not the norm, But in these cases, having those partnerships with proven past really supported immediate response. So advice there, do have someone that's going to track your expenses. Jess and I have been spending, feels like the last 8 months, working with finance to make sure, everything was in place. And if we hadn't had that, our lives would have been much harder. Lastly, one of the things that Jess and I noticed is that you're either in it or you're not. So there are a lot of people, that are going to come on site and they're not going to be able to step up to the challenge. It's just not who they are, and it's too much chaos. That's okay, but when you are on site, I think we realized you can tell who those people are, and those people need to, be given tasks to go support the day-to-day so that you can, sounds terrible, but get them out of the way, so that you can go and make the quick decisions. So I feel like you're going to find out, very quickly who on your operations team is going to be able to go and do. Make sure that you're giving them the appropriate task, and the people, that take longer to make a decision, you're going to put them on your day-to-day or have them help in other ways. So those would be probably my top few.
All right, Jess, give us yours.
I'm still very much in this every day to day. So my lessons learned are pretty specific and tactile. So one thing that I wish we would have had a better grasp on was a very organized asset list. I wish that our serial numbers had been listed in our inventory system so that we could just say, here, insurance, this is everything that was in the building, this is the serial number, you have it. We weren't quite there. We will be for next time. We weren't there though. So working with insurance through the asset recovery has been a struggle for us a bit. And the other piece was our master data for pallet weight, pallet dems, was non-existent for the plant support items that I had mentioned earlier. So whenever we were going to all of these new little mini sites in Evansville, and they'd say, sure, you can, we have room, come on, what's your product look like? Everyone just went, Oh, no one knew. So we struggled to find racks that would accommodate our product height or weight. And if that information had been loaded in SAP from the get-go, we would have had a much easier go at it. So those are a couple things that are pretty specific to our business, but will hopefully help you if hopefully you never have to do this.
All right, and then one more from Monique here.
Stick to your training, stick to your principles, and but also go with your gut, right? So I'll give you an example. While we were trying to shelter and get everybody together.
All right, so I'll let you know what Monique's saying there. So Monique it was very insightful actually. She said, trust your training and stick to it. She said her very first reaction when this happened was she wanted to immediately go check and make sure everybody was sheltered and make sure everybody was doing what they were supposed to. And if she were to have done that, right, she would have put herself in a huge amount of danger, right? She would not have been sheltered when she needed to be. And so she said, you absolutely have to trust your drills, your training, right? And really stick to that as much as you may have the urge to go see that everybody's done what you trained them to do. And so that was her big lesson learned there. And so we don't have much time left, right? But certainly excited to be working with Reckitt on the recovery efforts. We've learned a lot from this experience, as Jess mentioned, and as Stacy has said as well, right? And so, certainly excited about what we're doing, building more, resilient systems, more resilient processes. And so I think we have a lot to look forward to from that perspective. So before I close, I just wanted to see, we probably got time for maybe one question or two. Anybody have questions out there? Show of hands. All right, perfect. Hopefully we've taught you something that you'll never need to know. That's the hope, right? But certainly insightful information from folks that have been through it firsthand. And so real quick, just Open Sky Group, right? We do have a booth here, S4912. If you were here before, I think you got a postcard. We're doing a happy hour this evening, so feel free to come join us from 3 to 5 and visit our booth there. We'll hang around a little bit if you do have questions that you'd rather come up here and ask. But Jess and Stacy, I want to say thank you again for doing this with us. Your experience is incredibly valuable and unique, so just really appreciate you, and thank you again for doing this, and thank you all for attending. So have a great show.